If you think that Italy switched sides in World War II, you don't know history. If you are watching this video and you are surprised to hear that, start asking yourself why. In this video, I will explain why only a revisionist with a good dose of mental gymnastic could possibly say that Italy switched sides in World War II. I will give you 4 main reasons now, and later I will expand them with a timeline of events, more details and datas. This video is not aimed at defending fascism. The goal of this video is to easily debunk and ridicule the liars and revisionists, using timelines and datas that are in no way controversial nor debated. Everything I will present is widely accepted as historical facts, but it is not of common knowledge, especially outside of Italy. I invite you to do your own research and verify these facts. Mind you that since we are talking about fascist Italy, you are most certainly not able to find every information in English or in your own language. A huge amount of detailed information is available only in Italian, because of the lack of relevancy of the Italian Social Republic in foreign historiographies, which will be talked about at the end of the video. Reason number 1. There is not a single day in World War II in which a united Italy has been at war with Germany. At most, for a period of time, there were 2 Italian states, the Italian Social Republic, fighting for the Axis, and what remained of the Kingdom of Italy, fighting for the Allies. This period of time of the 2 Italian states is called the Italian Civil War. Later I will present a full timeline, and you will be able to confirm this statement. Reason number 2. During the Italian Civil War, the regular forces of the Italian Social Republic vastly outnumbered the regular forces of the Kingdom of Italy, the so-called Italian Co-belligerent army. While estimate varies, we are talking more or less of a 10-to-1 ratio. I will provide more details on this later, and will make more estimates taking into account paramilitary forces such as Partisans and Black Brigades. The difference will remain very big. Reason number 3. The Italian Social Republic units were deployed in many more theaters and fronts compared to the co-belligerent army, which fought only on one Italian front. Here the difference is astronomical. Reason number 4. This comes down to the definition of switching sides, and it's more about the Italian citizens than the state itself. Switching sides means fighting for one side of a war and then switch to fight for the other side of the war. The number of Italians who actively fought in World War II for both the Axis and the Allies is extremely small, especially if we consider only regular forces. The overwhelming majority of Italians who fought in World War II fought for the Axis. And it could be argued that even the ones who fought exclusively for the Allies are more than the ones who fought for both sides. These are 4 reasons that no historian can deny. But for those who don't believe this because they have learned history through memes and through biased Anglo-Saxon revisionism, let's expand the topic, starting from reason number 1. There isn't a single day in World War II in which a united Italy was at war with Germany. Let's start with the timeline. September 1939, World War II begins when Germany invades Poland on September 1st, followed by the declaration of war from France and the United Kingdom. Italy remains neutral until June 1940. June 10th, 1940, Italy joins World War II alongside Germany when Mussolini declares war on France and the United Kingdom. Fast forward to July 25th, 1943, the fall of fascism. Mussolini receives a vote of no confidence during the session of the Great Council of Fascism. In reality, some members of the Great Council and King Vittorio Emanuele III were plotting to overthrow Mussolini. The Allies had taken over Sicily by then, and the Axis was retreating on all fronts. Even though Mussolini still had supporters, the majority of the Great Council, including Mussolini's son-in-law Galeazzo Ciano, and Dino Grandi, who presented the motion, voted for a no confidence, so that a peace treaty with the Allies could be signed, and Italy could drop out of the war. Some believed that the war could still have been won, and wanted to keep Mussolini in power, but they were the minority. Few of the no-confidence voters didn't even aim at surrendering to the Allies, but believed that a more military competent leader could have changed the tide of the war. July 26, 1943, Mussolini meets the king at his residence to report the result of the Great Council of Fascism, but he falls into the king's trap. He's arrested and imprisoned. In Mussolini's place, the king names Marshal Pietro Badoglio. Badoglio assures the Germans that the Royal Italian Army will continue the war alongside Germany, but in reality he's setting the terms for the peace treaty with the Allies. For over 1 month, the Royal Italian Army is on standby, taking part only in defensive operations, with the exception of the Black Shirts legions, which kept actively fighting for the Axis. Black Shirts, or Milizia Volontaria per la Sicurezza Nazionale, MVSN in short, had evolved from the paramilitary corps of the Fascist Party in the 20s to elite troops in the 30s. Although infantry for the most part, they were usually better trained and better equipped than the larger, regular Royal Army. They took orders directly from Mussolini and were composed mostly by convinced fascists. September 8, 1943, the Armistice and Operation Achse. Italy signs the Armistice and officially surrenders to the Allies, becoming a neutral country and dropping out of the war. This is where a great deal of misconception and revisionism comes by. No Italian unit started taking orders and fighting for the Allies on the 8th of September. Germany already knew about the armistice way ahead of September 8th, even before vast majority of the Italian military, thanks to their spies and the fascist Italian officers who informed them. Even before the armistice was even announced, the German forces were ready to act. The Italian army was left mostly with no orders by the king and Badoglio, who were busy fleeing from Roma to the Allied-controlled southern Italy. The Allies were slow to react as well. They demanded King Vittorio Emanuele III to immediately declare war on Germany and were frustrated by his refusals. They wanted Italy forces to immediately fight against Germans, which didn't happen, not only because Italy was now a neutral country, but also because Italian troops, while they had no reasons to fight for Germany anymore, they also had no reasons to fight for the Allies either. As a result, Germans were almost completely unopposed when they quickly occupied Italy with Operation Achse. Operation Achse had 3 goals. 1. Neutralize, better if peacefully, all Italian forces that refused to continue the fight for the Axis, to avoid that they could reach southern Italy to collaborate with the Allies under the King's orders. 2. Obtain all the vehicles, weapons and equipment of said troops, so that they wouldn't fall into the Allies' hands. 3. Reorganize the fascist forces so that they could be able to continue the war alongside Germany. When Italian forces were confronted by the Wehrmacht, they usually had 3 choices. Choice number 1, to peacefully surrender their weapons and equipment to the German forces and accept to be imprisoned. Choice number 2, to not comply and be forcefully disarmed and possibly killed. Choice number 3, to accept to keep fighting for the Axis. Vast majority of Italian soldiers chose option number 1, to be peacefully disarmed. Some chose option number 2, and tried to resist, only to be defeated and eventually imprisoned or executed by German forces. But clashes between German and Italian forces were rare, much to the disappointment of the Allies. The only clashes that could be considered small battles would be, for example, the Battle of Roma, in which Germans successfully took possession of the Italian capital city, defeating the Royal Army units stationed there. The Italian officers couldn't even count on every Italian unit available at the time. For example, the Centauro division. Stationed outside of Roma, the Royal Army officers believed that the Centauro division would have helped the Germans take over the city, rather than obey Badoglio's orders. The same happened in the Dodecanese Islands, where clashes were much smaller than the size of the Italian garrisons stationed there, also because of the vast majority of Italian soldiers who had no intention to give their lives to fight for Great Britain, which was an enemy of Italy until the day prior, which forced the Italian governors and officials to surrender to the Germans, even to avoid civilian casualties. In the Greek island of Kefalonia, vast majority of the 10,000 soldiers of the Achse division, left to their destiny by the Black Shirts unit they were collaborating with, and not aided by the British nor any Greek partisan, were massacred and executed by the Wehrmacht, making these the most violent of those clashes. All these clashes happened when Italian troops refused to comply with German orders. In no case Italian troops attacked German forces under the Allies' orders. The only exception would be few units in the south of Italy, for example in Sardinia, where Italian units were involved in initial anti-German operations. But even among them, there were units who refused to obey such orders and helped the Germans retreat to North Italy. They were among those who chose option number 3, to immediately side with the Germans and continue the fight. Among them, there were virtually the entire corps of the Black Shirts. De jure, after the imprisonment of Mussolini, the Black Shirts passed under the command of the Royal Army, and were, still de jure, disbanded. Here is a big mistake that foreign history enthusiasts often make. Reading that the Black Shirts were incorporated into the Royal Army makes them believe the Black Shirts didn't exist anymore. De facto, it's very different. They were elite fascist troops, and even with Mussolini still in prison, the Black Shirts refused to obey Badoglio and the king, siding with the Germans. Estimates vary, but we are talking about 150,000 soldiers. Few units and the good majority of the navy were able to avoid confronting the Germans and surrender to the Allies in southern Italy. Here's another misconception. The Allies did not use these units in combat, and these units did not form the co-belligerent army. The Italian Co-belligerent army would be formed several months later, in spring 1944. The Allies disarmed and disbanded these Italian units, effectively putting an end to the Royal Italian Army, or any sort of military forces of the Kingdom of Italy for the time being. Operation Achse was a success for Germany. Very few Italian units opposed resistance, and very few reached the Allies. Almost all Italian equipment fell into German hands, and there was already a backbone of a new fascist Italian army ready to continue the war. September 12, 1943, the Gran Sasso Raid. Hitler wanted to find Mussolini and free him, to let him lead the new Italian army and state that the Germans were reorganizing. The location in which Mussolini was being kept prisoner was a secret, because the king wanted to avoid Black Shirts or German forces assaulting the prison Mussolini was being kept in to free him. But German intelligence, aided by information from Italian officials still loyal to Mussolini, quickly found out that Mussolini was being kept in Campo Imperatore, a hotel in the mountains of central South Italy. In a daring operation involving glider planes, Otto Skorzeni's German troops successfully raided the hotel to free Mussolini. The only casualties were 2 Italian soldiers stationed far away from the hotel, killed to avoid the chance they could call for reinforcements. It's clear from this operation how fascist saboteurs, who were surely among the troops in Campo Imperatore, helped the Germans raiding the hotel. The Italians who were only pretending to follow Badoglio's orders were not few. According to the reports, the guard dogs were locked in their rooms and the key was mysteriously gone. The 2 machine guns mounted on the roof were unmounted the day before, and the key to access the roof was also mysteriously gone. Alongside the Germans, there was the controversial figure of Italian Police General Fernando Soletti. His presence was very instrumental for the liberation of Mussolini, as he intimated the Italian guards to not shoot and not react. Soletti was a general known for being loyal to King Vittorio Emanuele III, and most historians agree that Soletti was being held hostage by the SS of Otto Skorzeny and forced to act in front of the Italian guards. But others casted some doubts over this. Reports say that Soletti was not unarmed, which is most unusual for hostages. After the operation, Soletti went into hiding and retired to private life, not aiding the Axis nor the Allies for the rest of the war. It's clear why the Germans chose someone like Soletti for this role. They could have chosen a hardline fascist like Farinacci or Pavolini, but the Italian guarding Mussolini wouldn't have been inclined to believe them any more than the SS. On the other hand, Soletti, being a man loyal to the king, would have definitely gave them more reasons to believe this was a planned operation. Mussolini was freed and brought to Germany to meet Hitler. September 18th to September 23rd, 1943. Establishment of the Italian Social Republic. Hitler wanted Mussolini to be the head of a new fascist state that would continue the war alongside Germany. Allegedly, Mussolini wasn't too keen, knowing that the war was almost surely lost, and that his role would have been a little more than the role of a puppet, but in the end he accepted. Speculations say that Hitler threatened Mussolini with the destruction of few northern Italian cities. Surely a bluff, Hitler had no reason to destroy cities and territories in German control, whose industries would have been useful to the German war machine. Moreover, the Germans knew that there were Italian officials who would have been willing to lead the new Italian state. Some speculated that Mussolini accepted to avoid Italy to be ruled by Roberto Farinacci, former lieutenant of the MVSN, admirer of Nazism, who would have probably ruled the country with an iron fist. On September 18th, Mussolini announces his return, the king's betrayal, and the establishment of a new state. On September 23rd, it's official. The Italian Social Republic is born. Also known as RSI or RSI, Repubblica Sociale Italiana, or Repubblica di Salò, from the city of Salò, where a good part of the government was situated. The Italian Social Republic immediately resumed the war against the Allies and started reorganizing an army based on the Black Shirts that never stopped their collaboration with German forces. Estimates vary and are in no way precise because it was a very chaotic time, but generally we talk about 200,000 between Black Shirts and the unit of the Royal Italian Army who opted to fight for the Axis. Soon the forces of the RSI would become much bigger thanks to conscription, but not exclusively. Therefore, after 15 days of official neutrality, Italy rejoins the war for the Axis as the Italian Social Republic. October 13th, 1943, the Kingdom of Italy rejoins the war. The armistice between the Kingdom of Italy and the Allies implied that the Italian forces had to collaborate with Anglo-American forces. Since German divisions were already in Italy to fight the Allies, there was no such thing as completely dropping out of the war. The Allies expected King Vittorio Emanuele III and Marshal Badoglio to comply with their orders after the armistice and immediately declare war on Germany, but both the king and Badoglio were reluctant to do so. They were not on board with Mussolini's plan anymore, but also had no will to let Italy fight for the Allies. The British and American commands were frustrated because of the idling and the continuous refusal from the king and Badoglio to declare war on Germany. King Vittorio Emanuele III didn't want to give up after the war any foreign land that belonged to the Italian Empire. Badoglio also didn't want Italian forces to act as sacrificial lambs for the Allies, something that the Allies were hoping to see. He would have rather seen Italian divisions being disarmed and taken prisoners, rather than seeing them being slaughtered. But with the establishment of the Italian Social Republic, which aimed at deposing the king and unifying Italy once again under fascism, Badoglio and the king gave in the demands of the Allies on the 13th of October, declaring war on Germany, but officially not on the Italian Social Republic, because that would have implied that the Kingdom of Italy would be recognizing the Italian Social Republic as a sovereign state. This happened more than 1 month after the armistice, after Germany took control of the majority of Italy, and after the Italian Social Republic rejoined the war for the Axis. The Italian soldiers who remained loyal to the king would eventually form the Italian Co-belligerent army, also known as the Army of the South. But this wouldn't happen anytime soon, because all Italian units that weren't imprisoned and weren't fighting for the Italian Social Republic were disarmed and disbanded by the Allies, who didn't trust Italians and had such a numerical advantage over the Axis that they hardly needed a bunch of poorly equipped Italian infantry. Even the remnants of the Italian Navy in southern Italy were only rarely used by the Allies. March 1944 to September 1944. It's only in March 1944 that the Italian Co-belligerent army begins assembling under the name of Corpo Italiano di Liberazione, Italian Liberation Corps. In reality, already at the end of November 1943, the Italian 1st Raggruppamento Motorizzato began collaborating with the Allies, but it was an isolated unit of barely 5,000 soldiers. In spring 1944, the Italian Liberation Corps counts around 20,000 soldiers, so still an extremely low number to consider an army, especially compared to the Italian Social Republic forces, already counting several 100,000 soldiers. Only September 1944, the Liberation Corps, renamed Gruppi di Combattimento, started to increase the number of its soldiers. It was rarely utilized by the Allies, who could count on numerical superiority against the Axis, and therefore rarely felt the need to use under-equipped and untrustworthy Italian co-belligerent units on the battlefield. It fought a handful of battles, all belonging to the southern front of the Italian campaign. April 29, 1945, the surrender of Caserta. After the Allies' offensive in spring 1945, the Italian Social Republic officially fell on the 29th of April 1945, with the surrender of Caserta, which was actually operative from the 1st of May 1945. Many placed the fall of the Italian Social Republic on the 25th of April 1945, but that is a mistake. That is a conventional date chosen after the war to commemorate the final defeat of fascism, as it was the day the partisan insurrection in the north began. From the 25th of April to the 1st of May, northern Italy was still a battlefield, with the surrender of the Italian Social Republic and the German forces in Italy signed only on the 29th of April, operative on May 1st. The surrender of the Axis forces was signed by Lieutenant Colonel Victor von Schweinitz on behalf of Army Group C General Heinrich von Fittinghoff and by Major Eugen Wenner on behalf of SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff and of the Italian Social Republic Minister of Defense Marshal Rodolfo Graziani. Mussolini was captured and shot by Italian partisans on April 26th, trying to flee to Switzerland while wearing a German military uniform. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani was the de facto leader of the Italian Social Republic for the few days between the death of Mussolini and the surrender of Caserta. A good number of German forces were in any case able to retreat to Austria and then Germany, although they were very low on supplies and ammunitions. Thanks to an agreement with Italian partisans, they were free to leave Italy without having to fight at the border. The agreement didn't extend to the Italian Social Republic forces though. Almost completely devoid of supplies and ammunitions, only a handful were able to cross the border to Austria. For many soldiers, there wasn't even a point abandoning their country and families to retreat to Austria. Some units had to fight until the last man, especially if facing Tito's Liberation Army in the northeast, or Italian partisans, as neither used to take prisoners, and surrendering would have just been a death sentence. The surrender of Caserta didn't just mean the fall of the Italian Social Republic, but also the definitive end of the World War II involvement for the Kingdom of Italy, as all Axis forces once operative in Italy were either defeated, imprisoned, or retreated to Austria. So, let's sum up the World War II timeline from the Italian perspective. September 1st, 1949 to June 9th, 1940. Italy is a neutral country. June 10th, 1940 to September 7th, 1943. Italy joins World War II and fights on the Axis side. September 8th, 1943 to September 22nd, 1943. After signing of the Armistice, Italy is once again a neutral country. September 23rd, 1943 to October 12th, 1943. There are now two Italian states. The Italian Social Republic in the north fights for the Axis. What remained of the Kingdom of Italy in the south is still a neutral country. October 13th, 1943 to April 30th, 1945. The Italian Social Republic keeps fighting for the Axis. The Kingdom of Italy is co-belligerent with the Allies, although with a fraction of the fascist forces of the Italian Social Republic. May 1st, 1945, the Italian Social Republic has fallen. Italy is unified again under the monarchy and drops out of the war. As you can see, not even for a single day in World War II, a united Italy was at war with Germany. When the Kingdom of Italy was at war alongside the Allies, the Italian Social Republic was at war alongside Germany, with much larger forces. Any attempt to claim that Italy switches sides in World War II is easily debunked by this timeline. This brings us to reason number 2. During the Italian Civil War, the regular forces of the Italian Social Republic vastly outnumber the regular forces of the Kingdom of Italy. How many soldiers served in the Italian Social Republic forces and how many for the Kingdom of Italy after the Armistice? Estimates vary a lot, especially in the case of the Italian Social Republic, and the two main reasons are German involvement. A good number of Italian units that after the Armistice immediately chose to continue the war for the Axis did so under direct Wehrmacht command. These units are often not accounted for, because even if they were formally units of the Italian Social Republic from its establishment, they served for the majority or for the totality of the war outside of the Italian borders. The Wehrmacht had no reason nor time to create more than the bare minimum documents regarding those Italian units. That was the case for the many RSI units dislocated in the Balkans and for the Italienische Nebelwerfer Battalion, 5 anti-aircraft battalions that served on the German Baltic coast and fought later also as infantry against both the Red Army and the Allies. They were among the last Italian units to surrender on May 3, 1945. The same can be said for some of the Italian soldiers, former German prisoners of war, who agreed to resume the fight for the Axis. At times they were trained in Germany and assigned to those RSI units that operated abroad. But the main reason is that it's notorious in Italy how the great part of the Italian Social Republic archives were on purpose destroyed in the last days of the war, to protect the former Italian Social Republic soldiers from retaliations, imprisonment and executions after the war. Therefore, the official military documents regarding the amount of soldiers who served in RSI divisions is scarce. With that said, let's briefly pass to the composition of the Italian Social Republic forces. There were 3 main corps. Esercito Nazionale Repubblicano, National Republican Army. This was the regular army of the Social Republic. It was deployed against the Allies mainly in Italy, but also had several units abroad, all around Europe, especially in the Balkans. Many units abroad also fought under the Wehrmacht in anti-aircraft artillery divisions. At times the army also conducted anti-partisan operations. Guardia Nazionale Repubblicana, National Republican Guard. Don't get fooled by the word guard. This wasn't a police corps. They were part of the Italian Social Republic armed forces. They were composed in large part by former black shirts, so elite soldiers who usually received a better training and a better equipment compared to the regular royal soldiers up until the Armistice. They were deployed mainly against partisans in Italy and were protagonists of various reprisals, but also fought against the Allies, especially towards the end of the war. They mainly operated in Italy, but some units were also deployed in neighboring countries, among them the Guardia Nazionale Repubblicana di Frontiera, National Republican Border Guard. The line is sometimes blurred between the National Republican Army and the National Republican Guard. In the later stages of the war, and especially in 1945, there was basically no more distinction between them, other than the name, as the Guard was de facto incorporated into the army. The official armed forces of the Italian Social Republic are considered the sum of the National Republican Army and the National Republican Guard, but they weren't the only combatants of the RSI. Brigate Nere, the Black Brigades. Sometimes mistakenly mixed up with the black shirts, they were a paramilitary group established in 1944 by the secretary of the newly formed Republican Fascist Party, Alessandro Pavolini. They were composed by volunteers among the members of the party. Their goal was local patrolling, anti-partisan operations, and assistance of German and Italian forces. Towards the end of the war, some brigades engaged the Allies in battle. They were still armed forces, although paramilitary, as their equipment was comparable to the ones of the official armies, and not to the one of police corps. But since they were obviously at the bottom of the line among Italian forces, they suffered from lack of weapons and equipment, and were often unable to arm all the soldiers at disposal. They also included people who, for a reason or another, would not be accepted into the regular armed forces of the Italian Social Republic. Women, 2 young boys, 2 old men, mentally unstable individuals, and former criminals. Let's talk about the estimated numbers. How many soldiers fought for the Italian Social Republic forces between 1943 and 1945? For the National Republican Army, the number 300,000 is often thrown around. That is not correct, but it's not a made-up number either. The Italian Social Republic and the Axis in general simply couldn't supply a vast amount of soldiers for a prolonged period of time, because the supplies, the weapons, the ammunitions and the fuel were getting more and more scarce in the second half of World War II. After all, the Axis was defeated in the North African campaign exactly because of this. Most Axis troops simply exhausted every single bullet available, and there was no more fuel to power armored vehicles. 300,000 soldiers is an estimate of the largest amount of soldiers that the National Republican Army was able to supply and deploy at a certain given time, meaning that no more than 300,000 soldiers were deployed at the same moment. Others were simply on standby or had other duties, as Italy was not able to arm them at the moment. That is a huge difference than having just and not more than 300,000 soldiers. The number is debated because reports from the spring of 1944 speak about 330,000 active soldiers at the time. But that's not how soldiers of an army are counted. We need the total amounts of soldiers who fought for the National Republican Army. Most Italian historians, such as Diego Meldi and Marino Vigano, place this number between 500,000 and 600,000. The official historical archives of the Italian army place the number at 560,000 confirmed soldiers, although sources differ on whether this includes the National Republican Guard or not. Few remaining Italian Social Republic documents, such as Rapporto Graziani, which includes datas and statements by RSI General Emilio Canevari, also talk about a similar number for the National Republican Army alone. Other than 260,000 auxiliary military workers reported, which I obviously will not count. These datas do not come from the fascist propaganda, which would make them unreliable, rather from internal documents of the Italian Social Republic, and considered plausible by historians such as Meldi. So let's take 550,000 soldiers as an amount. What about the National Republican Guard? Here there is a bigger consensus in placing their total number at around 150,000. Of course, they suffered the same problem. At no time 150,000 soldiers of the Guard were deployed at the same time. This is the total amount of soldiers who served in the National Republican Guard. Also for the Black Brigades, there is a bigger consensus. Their size was around 120,000 soldiers. The Black Brigades were the corps that struggled the most with equipment, being at the back of the line. It's estimated that at most 30,000 Black Brigades were deployed at the same time. All in all, we reach a number of 820,000 Italians who fought for the Italian Social Republic forces. It's not correct to say that between September 1943 and April 1945, these were the only Italians who fought for the Axis. These are the ones who fought officially for the Italian Social Republic, either in regular or paramilitary forces. But there were also Italians who served as volunteers in the Wehrmacht and in the Waffen-SS. The 29th Waffen-Grenadier-Division der SS, Italienische Nummer 1, more simply called Italian Waffen-SS Legion, counted around 20,000 soldiers. There were Italian volunteers in other mixed Waffen-SS divisions, such as the 17th Götz von Berlichingen and the 24th Karstjäger, but the size of the Italian component of these divisions is basically impossible to tell. The same goes for the Italian volunteers in the Wehrmacht, often being former prisoners of war and often deployed as anti-aircraft forces. It's estimated that around 60,000 Italian soldiers served in the Luftwaffe Flak Division, but their number should already be included in the forces of the National Republican Army. In total, a fair estimate of Italian forces serving directly under Germany would be around 30,000. So we can say that the Italian military forces who kept fighting for the Axis after the Armistice amounted to around 850,000 soldiers. This does not include police forces and auxiliary troops, which would otherwise spike the number to well more than 1 million individuals. A particular case, though, is the Servizio Ausiliario Femminile, the female auxiliary service, strong of more than 6,000 volunteers. Although the name suggests that they were auxiliary troops, they were officially considered military personnel with a war volunteer status. Unlike regular military workers who worked in Italian or German industries, the women of the auxiliary service were trained in combat as well. According to most historians, they never took part in actual military operations, mostly because the Italian Social Republic struggled to arm its regular troops, and these women were considered on par with military reserves. However, other historians, such as Cecilia Nubola, state that elements of the female auxiliary service took part in anti-partisan operations alongside the National Republican Guard. After the war, both Italian partisans and the Allies treated the female auxiliary service members not as auxiliary, but as fascist soldiers. Some Italian partisans happened to rape or kill various members of the service, while the Allies imprisoned them in their prison camps alongside the Republican soldiers. However, since it's plausible that only a small number of them took part in anti-partisan operation, I will not include them. Let's talk about the numbers of the co-belligerent army. As we already said, the Italian Liberation Corps counted just 20,000 soldiers between spring and autumn of 1944. If you search on Google, the first AI result says 250,000 soldiers in 1945. That is absolutely misleading, and I would be surprised if this data wasn't falsified on purpose, but it's easily debunkable. We'll talk about revisionism later. This number comes from the Italian Wikipedia page, but the same Wikipedia page says that between 150,000 and 190,000 were auxiliary, not combatant troops. Indeed, if we search on other websites, there is quite a consensus that the Italian co-belligerent army had only 50,000 to 60,000 soldiers. For example, this is a report on the website of ANPI, National Association of Italian Partisans, surely not an Italian Social Republic propaganda page. Let's be generous towards the co-belligerent army and say 60,000 soldiers. If I were to count the 200,000 auxiliary troops, I would also have to count the 260,000 auxiliary troops of the Italian Social Republic. What about the partisans? Normally I would only count the regular soldiers of each state to make a comparison, and partisans aren't regular forces, they are compared to rebels. But I will still count them in. I have counted in the Black Brigades for the Italian Social Republic, and the Black Brigades weren't regular forces, they were paramilitary. They had the approval of the Italian Social Republic state, and they had military equipment when they were able to have it. Partisans also had poor equipment compared to armed forces, but they could be considered guerrilla infantry. No planes, no tanks, no vehicles, no machine guns and no artillery, unless of course they could steal it from Axis forces. But since Italian partisans saw much more action between 1943 and 1945 than the Italian co-belligerent army and were able in the last stages of the war to inflict damage to a resource-starved Axis, it would be unfair to not count them in. The question is, who counts as a partisan? A man who grabs a rifle and participates in anti-Axis operations and collaborates with the Allies is certainly a partisan. But what about a civilian who helps partisans stock weapons and supplies but never shoots a single shot? Or what about an old woman who gives partisans a hideout in her attic? They can certainly be considered partisans, but not combatants. How many Italian partisans were in total? Some sources claim from 200,000 to even 350,000, but it's almost impossible to say, and obviously we cannot count them all in, otherwise we'll have to count any partisan sympathizer civilian, and every fascist sympathizer civilian as soldiers and combatants. So how many of them were combatants? After World War II, the Italian state recognized and certified 137,000 partisans as people who gave an important contribution to the resistance against fascism and Nazism on Italian soil. Now let's compare the Italian Social Republic forces with the co-belligerent forces. The difference is astronomical. The Italian Social Republic had more than 10 times the size of regular forces than the Kingdom of the South, what remained of the Kingdom of Italy. Let's add the paramilitary forces. In fairness, there's to add the 30,000 Italians who volunteered in the Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht. Mind you, here we are not talking about the Italians who fought in the Italian Civil War, but the ones who fought in regular and paramilitary forces between September 1943 and May 1945. So RSI units that fought abroad are obviously counted. There are reports of few partisan brigades that operated alongside Tito's Liberation Army in Yugoslavia, but that would change the estimate by a minuscule amount, if it's not already included. Another thing that I want to point out is that these numbers do not represent the ideals of the Italians at the time. Those 850,000 were not all fascist, of course, as there was mandatory conscription, but these are the numbers that effectively took part in operations either for the co-belligerent forces or for the Italian Social Republic. The many Italian prisoners of war, whether prisoners of the Germans or prisoners of the Allies, counted well over 1 million soldiers. Some would have for sure chosen to join the co-belligerent army, but couldn't. Some would have chosen to join the Italian Social Republic forces, but couldn't. Actually, even Italian Social Republic officials requested the release of more Italian prisoners of war willing to rejoin the fight. But at times, Germans were unwilling to do so, as they knew that manpower wasn't the problem for the RSI forces, which relied heavily on German support, preferring to transform those willing prisoners into laborers. To be even more generous, since the failing Italian Social Republic forces were plagued by desertions or by units that could barely be equipped, let's remove, let's say, 50,000 from the estimate, as soldiers that for one reason or another never saw action a single time. To be fair, we should remove some soldiers also from the co-belligerent forces, because some units were created so late into the war that they never saw the battlefield, like the Gruppo di Combattimento Mantova. But I will give yet another pass to the co-belligerent forces. I have been strict counting the Italian Social Republic forces and generous counting the co-belligerent forces. And yet the estimates are 800,000 for the Italian Social Republic forces and 200,000 for the co-belligerent forces. A ratio of 4-to-1, with a difference of 600,000 soldiers. And yet we have pseudo-historians, but most importantly, people who don't know history, claiming that somehow Italy switched sides. We could, by stretching the definition of co-belligerent army, include the few divisions of the Royal Italian Army that immediately after the Armistice refused to obey orders and be peacefully disarmed. But counting an approximate number of soldiers is extremely difficult, because even within the same Italian divisions, we could have units that tried to resist the Germans, units that were peacefully disarmed, and units that chose to immediately continue the fight for the Axis. But bringing the number estimate of regular troops of the co-belligerent army from 60,000 to 120,000 to be very generous changes very little. Even when being strict with the fascist forces and generous with the anti-fascist forces, the ratio is still around 4-to-1, with a difference of 600,000 soldiers, which is already quite a big reach. As if numbers were not enough, consider this. As we know, before the Armistice, Italian forces were short on supplies, ammunition, fuel, and not many vehicles were combat ready. When we talk about land forces, virtually the totality of supplies, vehicles, tanks, fuel and artillery were seized by fascist or German forces to be later utilized by the Italian Social Republic. Only some ill-equipped infantry surrendered to the Allies. The same goes for the Air Force, which joined in large part the newly established National Republican Air Force. Different was for the Navy, which in large part surrendered to the Allies instead. And although it went to form the co-belligerent Navy, it was pretty much never utilized by the Allies. Ironically, the Decima Flotilla Mass, considered the elite division of the entire Royal Navy before the Armistice, joined the Italian Social Republic and was one of the most active and independent divisions fighting for the Axis during the Italian campaign. Reason number 3. The Italian Social Republic units were deployed in many more theaters and fronts compared to the co-belligerent army, which fought only on one Italian front. The Italian campaign had 3 fronts: the Southern Front, which was fought on the Gustav Line and later on the Gothic Line, the Northwestern Front and the Northeastern Front. The Italian co-belligerent army only fought a handful of battles on the Southern Italian Front. Also, the Italian Social Republic forces saw of course action on the Southern Front, but more often than the co-belligerent army, for a very simple reason. The Allies had numerical advantage, other than having more weapons, vehicles, ammunitions and equipment than the Axis. They weren't in desperate needs of few thousand ill-equipped Italian soldiers who they didn't even trust too much. Hence why the co-belligerent army was scarcely used. On the other hand, the Germans needed every man they could get. Unfortunately for the Axis, the Italian Social Republic could offer plenty of men but very little resources, vehicles and equipment. The Germans heavily sponsored the fast creation of the Italian Social Republic army because they needed manpower for the Italian front and the Balkan front, especially in Yugoslavia. Italian Social Republic units on the main southern Italian front are rarely talked about because they were often integrated into Wehrmacht bigger units and therefore often labeled as Germans. After all, the Italian Social Republic forces were never conducting operations against the Allies by themselves on the southern front, always in subordination of German divisions they were working with. However, it's worth noting that the Battle of Garfagnana, also called Operation Wintergewitter or Operation Winter Thunderstorm, was a successful Axis counterattack in December 1944 that was led by Italian Social Republic forces, which represented 70% of the Axis soldiers of that operation. The operation was planned by Marshal Rodolfo Graziani with German blessings and led by German General Otto Fretter-Pico and Italian General Mario Carloni. It's considered the last successful Axis counteroffensive in Europe. Unlike the co-belligerent army, the Italian Social Republic forces fought also on the other two Italian fronts, and they operated more independently from German forces compared to the Southern Front. In the northwest, against American and Free French troops, we can name the Grenadier Division Littorio, the Marine Infantry Division San Marco, the Alpine Division Monte Rosa, and the Decima Flottiglia Mass. The Decima Mass was also active on the northeastern front against Tito's Yugoslav partisans, alongside the Bersaglieri Battalion Mussolini and the infamous Legion Tagliamento of the Guardia Nazionale Repubblicana, among other units. Of course, on both fronts and in northern Italy in general, Italian Social Republic forces had to deal with Italian partisans as well. What about abroad? I am not going to count every single Italian unit in the Wehrmacht anti-aircraft artillery divisions, or I would have to paint the entirety of Europe with the RSI flag. I'm also not going to count auxiliary bases and camps, or small units that never saw the battlefield. Keep in mind that naming and counting all Italian troops of the RSI dislocated abroad is virtually impossible. As previously mentioned, many were under German command and reorganized according to their decisions, without the government of the Italian Social Republic ever having a say in it or much information on the whereabouts and the amount of Italian soldiers abroad. The largest presence of Italian Social Republic forces abroad is without a doubt in Yugoslavia. After the Armistice, all black shirt legions stationed in Yugoslavia sided with the Germans, and most of them continued to operate Yugoslavia until the end of the war. They were alongside some battalions of the Royal Army that refused to obey Marshal Badoglio's orders of surrender and to cease collaboration with German forces. To name a few, former black shirt legions Marche, Farini, Indomita, and units of Legion Ferrucci, Battalion Scaligero, Irpino, and Berga, 3 battalions of the National Republican Guard, and many other battalions. They all served in Yugoslavia, and because of the advance of Tito's Liberation Army and the progressive Axis retreat, they were often moved throughout the country, from the former Protectorate of Albania to the now former Yugoslav republics of Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia. Since the dislocation of these forces often changed and spanned the entire Yugoslavia, no point trying to pinpoint the exact locations. In the last days of the war, while Tito's Liberation Army was attacking the Italian city of Trieste, the now Croatian city of Rijeka, and few other Yugoslav locations were still under Italian control. A number of these RSI forces dislocated in Yugoslavia ended up retreating in Austria at the very end of the war. With the fall of the Italian Social Republic, some Italian soldiers never returned to Italy to avoid persecution by partisans and by the Allies. Units were present also in Greece. Among them there were the Legion Conteverde in the island of Rhodos, 4 battalions in the island of Crete, Merla, Piassi, Gabriele, and 1 former M battalion, the elite battalions of the Black Shirts, now serving in the National Republican Guard. 1 legion on the island of Samos and 1 battalion in Thessaloniki. In France, other than the divisions stationed at the French-Italian border that fought in the Second Battle of the Western Alps against French and American forces, we can name Divisione Atlantica Fucilieri di Marina, Marine Riflemen Atlantic Division, or more simply, Marine Infantry Atlantic Division. This division had 10,000 Italian soldiers at its dependence. It was stationed in Bordeaux and operated on the French Atlantic coast and on the Channel Islands. It took part in Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings, specializing in coastal artillery battery warfare. Alongside German forces during Operation Overlord, there was only 1 division belonging to another country. It was the Divisione Atlantica Fucilieri di Marina of the Italian Social Republic. They took part in the defense of the French island of Cessembre, alongside German soldiers, an island known for being the most bombed location per square meter of World War II. There were also smaller Italian units in the south of France, subordinate to larger German forces, stationed in Nice and Toulon. On the Eastern Front, we have the already mentioned Italienische Nebelwerfer Battalion, 5 anti-aircraft battalions that served on the German Baltic coast. They were specialized in creating artificial fog to hide objectives that could have been targets of Allied or Russian bombings. Later, they were used also as infantry against both the Red Army and the British. They were dislocated in Peenemünde, Usedom, Wollin, and Swinemünde. Some consider them the last Italian unit to surrender on May 3, 1945. Also, the Battalion 9 Settembre fought on the Eastern Front against the Red Army at the end of 1944 in Eastern Prussia, today is Poland, in the Masurian Lake region. Alongside the German division Brandenburg, they attempted to defend the city of Angerburg, today called Vegorzevo. Some sources talk about an Italian artillery unit stationed in Hungary. While its existence and location seem very plausible, I'm unable to find more information on this, and therefore, not knowing if that unit ever fought in Hungary against the Red Army, I will not include it on the map. A special mention for the Far East, the Italian concession of Tianjin in China. Many revisionists like to suggest that after the armistice, Japanese forces attacked the Italian soldiers in Tianjin. That is unsurprisingly false, as there is no evidence of a single shot being fired. The Japanese forces did indeed occupy the zone and questioned the Italian soldiers on their allegiance. Almost the totality of Italians eventually chose to join the Italian Social Republic and were later repatriated in Europe. As the Italian Social Republic was not military involved in the Far East, I'll put no flag. If we take a look at the map, the difference is huge. These are the regular forces. These are the regular forces plus partisans. Once again, proof of the mental gymnastic needed to say that Italy switched sides. Even if we add few more Kingdom of Italy flags to symbolize the units that try to resist Germans after the armistice, the difference remains big, especially when we consider that the number of soldiers who fought against Germans in those cases is smaller than the Italian Social Republic units deployed in those locations, and their involvement after the armistice was only a couple of days long, not years as is the case for the Italian Social Republic troops. Reason number 4. What is switching sides? Switching sides means fighting for one side of a war and then switch to fight for the other side of the war. The number of Italians who actively fought in World War II for both the Axis and the Allies is extremely small, especially if we consider only regular forces. The overwhelming majority of Italians who fought in World War II fought for the Axis. And it could be argued that even the ones who fought only for the Allies were more. As we already mentioned, immediately after the armistice, the great majority of the Royal Italian Army peacefully surrendered and accepted to be disarmed and imprisoned by the Wehrmacht. Vast majority of these 700,000 to 1 million soldiers surrendered and dropped out of the war. They did not fight against Germany at any point of the war. Therefore, they did not switch any side. Almost the totality of the 600,000 Italian prisoners in Allied prison camps never had any choice to rejoin the war alongside the Allies. They were prisoners of war before the armistice and remained prisoners of war until the end of the war, never fighting against the Axis and therefore not switching any side. Among the Italians who joined the Co-belligerent army or Partisan brigades, many were young men who were never conscripted before the armistice and never previously saw the battlefield. They also never switched any side, because they never fought for the Axis to begin with and only collaborated with the Allies. So effectively, who switched sides? First, the Italian units of the Royal Army that, immediately after the armistice, refused to comply with German disarmament and tried to resist. Although let's not forget that in virtually the totality of those cases, Italian forces never attacked German troops, only defended against them. Second, the former soldiers of the Royal Army who didn't join the Italian Social Republic and avoided German capture, later joining either the Co-belligerent army or the Partisans. So how many were they? It's impossible to tell. We could try to count how many units engaged German forces after the armistice, but the problem is that often the behavior of one whole division is generalized, whether the division chose to peacefully surrender or refused to obey German orders. But many divisions were splintered into smaller units, dislocated in different locations, and that were separately confronted by German forces. Within the Italian divisions that chose to peacefully surrender, there could have been units that at least tried to resist, and, much more often, within divisions whose officers chose to not comply with German orders. There were units that were refusing to engage German forces or to fight alongside the Allies and peacefully surrendered. On the island of Rhodos, Admiral Inigo Campioni had 40,000 soldiers to defend the island against less than 10,000 Germans. After just 2 days of brief skirmishes, while Campioni was in contact with both the Royal Italian Command and with German officials, it was decided to surrender to avoid bombings and civilian deaths. So even though the Italian Infantry Division Regina and other Italian forces amounted to 40,000 soldiers, only a fraction of them engaged Germans in combat at any point. Another example is the Infantry Division Bergamo, stationed in the Croatian city of Split. General Emilio Becuzzi ordered his soldiers to let the Yugoslav partisans disarm them. The plan was to either fight alongside Yugoslav partisans against Germans who for sure would have tried to take over the city, or to let the division being peacefully disarmed by either Yugoslav or Germans, which probably meant imprisonment for the Italian soldiers. A great number of soldiers refused to obey these orders, breaking cannons, artillery and vehicles, throwing rifles and ammunition into the sea, as they had no intention of fighting against Germans and collaborating with Yugoslav partisans, that at the time were already starting to execute civilians and soldiers who they considered criminals of war. The Yugoslav partisans, not able to put their hands on the great majority of Italian armament, understood that it would have been impossible to defend the city against a German attack and left. General Becuzzi cowardly left his division by boarding an Italian ship to make a return home. Although some units of the division located elsewhere tried to resist the disarmament, when the Germans arrived in Split, they found no opposition. The Germans rounded up the Italian officials and executed them for collaboration or attempt collaboration with Yugoslav partisans. The soldiers stationed in Split instead chose either peaceful imprisonment or to continue the fight for the Axis. What is certain and widely accepted is that, as mentioned, the Italians that tried to resist German disarmament were a fraction of those who peacefully surrendered, and less even than the Italians who chose immediately to continue the fight for the Axis. The Italian Co-belligerent army was very small, and great part of its soldiers were newly conscripts and volunteers. But the Partisan Brigades had actually a good component of former Royal Italian soldiers. It's extremely difficult to quantify them, but usually also partisans are considered for the majority being composed by young men who escaped conscription, rather than former soldiers. An estimate of fallen partisans during the Italian Civil War speaks of 17,000 former soldiers and 37,000 civilian partisans. And although there is the question that we already asked, who is considered a partisan, this gives at least some proportion. In the end, we're talking about low numbers compared to the total number of Italians who fought in World War II. Whether we accept 80,000 or 100,000 Italians who fought on both sides of World War II, it doesn't change much. They were a tiny percentage compared to more than 1 million Italian soldiers, prisoners of the Germans or the Allies, and compared to the 800,000 Italian soldiers that fought for the Axis after the Armistice. Some would argue that they were less even of the Italians who solely fought for the Allies during World War II, but I won't even expand on these because it's beyond the point. Yet another proof of the bias and the revisionism needed to say that Italians switched sides. So as a last point, why is it said that Italy switched sides in World War II, and is there any truth in this? Usually, the argument used by those who know Italian history but won't somehow imply that Italy actually switched sides is the Italian Social Republic was a puppet state with limited recognition. Therefore, its forces don't represent Italy. Basically, they're asking us to ignore the Italian Social Republic and pretend that its more than 700,000 soldiers never existed and focus on the small co-belligerent forces and partisans, which is obviously pathetic revisionism. Ignoring the, pardon the term, bad guys doesn't make them disappear from history. History says the Italian Social Republic forces, and more in general, the Italian pro-Axis forces, between the Armistice and the end of the war, were far, far larger than the Italian pro-Allies forces, and nothing can change this fact. As for international recognition, it's quite obvious that the Allies weren't going to recognize a newly established state that rebelled against King Vittorio Emanuele III, who was collaborating with them. The Italian Social Republic was a state recognized only by Axis countries. Neutral countries like Sweden or Switzerland would have been crazy to recognize the Italian Social Republic, given the dire situation of the Axis, nor they would have had any reason to do so. It would have put them in hot waters with the Allies. It's obvious that those neutral countries would have recognized the Italian Social Republic if the Axis would have won the war, as they would have had no real choice, since probably the Kingdom of Italy would have ceased to exist in that case. They hold on the international recognition argument in a war where there are two sides, and obviously one side is not going to recognize a new ally of the other side. The limited recognition received by the Italian Social Republic is very well expected. It would have been absurd otherwise. Just because a state is not recognized de jure, it doesn't mean we should pretend it didn't exist, because de facto it existed in a far larger manner than the legitimate remnant of the Kingdom of Italy. Nobody implies that the Italian Social Republic was the legitimate Italian state, just as nobody should imply that the Italian Social Republic forces shouldn't be counted because they weren't the legitimate Italian state. As in the military context of World War II, which of the two Italian states was the legitimate is absolutely irrelevant. Picture this: if we look at the numbers, it would be more accurate saying Italy fought for the Axis for the entirety of World War II, rather than Italy switched sides, as in this way we're ignoring what remained of the Kingdom of Italy, whose forces were much smaller than the Italian Social Republic ones, and fought in far less occasions. But of course, since I'm not like those who pretend the Italian Social Republic never existed, I don't say this. Even if the co-belligerent army was a tiny, barely utilized army, and the combatant partisans were heavily outnumbered by fascist forces all over Europe, they still existed. They have to be remembered, and it's revisionism to pretend they never existed. Just like the Italian Social Republic existed, it should be remembered, and it's revisionism to pretend it never existed. This with the addition of the blatant lie and the bad faith of generalizing by suggesting that the minority was the norm. But who are those that keep perpetuating this false belief that Italy switched sides? Of course, many don't do it on purpose, as they're just ignorant, but there are those who do. I divide the culprits in two groups, Italians and foreigners. In Italy, the two main perpetrators are elements of the Italian left wing and elements of the Italian capitalist Anglophile right wing. I've said elements exactly not to group everyone together. The Italian left wing often tries to highlight partisan feats. Here I'm not talking about what was right or what was wrong. I'm talking about what was more or less significant in the military context of World War II. As expected, modern Italian school history books tend to focus far more on partisan activity than on the Italian Social Republic and co-belligerent army. But this anti-fascist sentiment is so strong in some people that it brings them to revisionism, to deny the participation of Italian Social Republic forces in military operations all over Europe, and to deny their large size. This to discredit fascism as much as possible, to give the impression that the real Italians were the partisans and the ones who collaborated with the Allies, and that they also represented a larger number compared to fascists. I don't think anybody expects praises towards the actions and the ideals of the fascist state, but to be so anti-fascist that it is impossible to withstand any data and any historical source that shows how large were the RSI forces is ridiculous. Some people even go as far as calling the fascists of the Italian Social Republic traitors, because they disobeyed the king's orders, refusing to surrender and continuing the fight for their ideals alongside their allies. And this, from a foreigner point of view, sounds quite silly. In reality, these elements that I repeat are not the entirety of the Italian left wing should take pride in the fact that even when heavily outnumbered, the combatant partisans were able to be a danger for Axis forces in Italy, without the need of trying to falsely make fascists look few and weak. There could be an element of wanting to hide the war crimes that fascist Italy, including the Italian Social Republic, committed, and present Italy as a less pro-Axis country. But honestly, this just sounds disrespectful towards the victims. Nobody is denying the crimes of fascist Italy. Celebrating is one thing, remembering is another. Also, the Italian right wing is guilty of this. They, on the other hand, tried to boost the numbers and the feats of the co-belligerent army. They can be anti-fascist nationalists who want to show that the Italian military was capable when it wasn't fascist. Or they could be NATO-loving Anglophiles, so eager to show that Italians served their American lords well, by switching sides and obey them against the evil Germans, to make it look like Italy and the United States, or Great Britain, had always been great allies. It sounds like a childish argument, but that's because it is indeed a childish reason. The sad thing is that this childish reason is gladly used by many, if not most, of Italian political parties. This revisionism from the right wing is even more ridiculous. Consider the co-belligerent was a miniature army that fought very rarely and in a very limited geographical context, compared to the far larger Italian Social Republic forces who fought far more and all over Europe, whether they were volunteers or forced conscripts. I'll give you an example of this revisionism. This is a screenshot of the old Wikipedia page on the National Republican Army. Note the size estimate, not too far off from reality. Now look at the current Wikipedia page. Instead of writing the total number of the soldiers who took part in the Italian campaign and the Civil War, they wrote the size of the army on a specific day, on April 9th, 1945, so when the Italian Social Republic forces were falling apart because of lack of supplies, equipment, and of course the Allied Spring Offensive that started few days earlier, which already attacked and captured German and Italian units. But the biggest revisionism is the co-belligerent army's size, 250,000 soldiers. Sure, if you count the 200,000 auxiliary troops that, being auxiliary, never saw the battlefield. Where are the 260,000 Italian Social Republic auxiliary troops? Look at this Wikipedia page. It shows many estimates on Italy in World War II. Also here, the fascist forces are estimated at April 9th, 1945. It doesn't mention the more than 700,000 combatants of the Italian Social Republic, belonging to the National Republican Army, National Republican Guard, and Black Brigades between 1943 and 1945. Although that estimate includes the Italian Social Republic units that were deployed all over Europe, not just Italy. Let's take a look at the other estimates, which by the way don't have a source. The estimate for the Italian Social Republic forces requires a source, but for the partisans and the Italian co-belligerent army, apparently not. 340,000 partisans of the 25th of April 1945. So during the partisan insurrection, that is even more than the highest and most generous estimate on the number of partisans. As we showed earlier in the video, historians estimate the number of partisans during the Italian Civil War at around 140,000. During the final partisan insurrection, the most generous estimate, 250,000, but it is always mentioned that nowhere near that number engaged in combat. Many were civilians who joined the partisan cause in the last days of the war during the insurrection. Many of them did not ever engage in combat. It would be already dishonest considering all of them as combatant partisans. But here we arrive to even 340,000, an estimate not found anywhere else. Are they counting as partisan every civilian that helped partisans in any way? But the biggest revisionism comes from the co-belligerent army, Italian Corps with the Allied forces, 379,000. Where does that number come from? We already saw how historians estimate the number of combatants of the Italian co-belligerent army between 50 and 60,000, with 200,000 auxiliary troops. If it was written 250,000 soldiers for the Italian co-belligerent army, it would still be dishonest because the estimate of the Italian Social Republic does not include the 260,000 estimated auxiliary troops and militarized workers. But here we go even beyond that. I have no idea how they went from 250,000 to 379,000. This cannot be considered in any other way than dishonest revisionism. The estimates that I wrote are the ones that are widely accepted and plausible. These ones, especially for the Italian co-belligerent army, are nowhere to be found elsewhere, and I guarantee you no historian could possibly agree with them. If someone can edit this page and call out this biased estimate, they would help stop the spread of disinformation and historical revisionism. The funny thing is that in reality, the difference between the RSI forces and the co-belligerent forces was so big that even if you take this amount on April 9th, 1945, it would still be double the amount of the totality of soldiers who fought for the co-belligerent army over the course of the entire civil war. It's obvious why this was done. It was taken as a reference a date from April 1945, when Italian Social Republic forces were at their lowest, while counting the 200,000 auxiliary troops for the co-belligerent army, to give the false impression that many more Italians were fighting for the Allies than for the Axis. Whether this was done to discredit fascism, to hide Italy's involvement in the Axis, or to make it look like Italy had always been on the Allies' side, whether it was left-wing or right-wing revisionism, it's still revisionism, and a very poor attempt at it. You might think that Wikipedia is not a trustworthy website. The problem is, it influences readers with this wrong information and even influences the Google AI overview that many people read. Never trust the AI overview on history. Always explore and read more on the topic, even on Wikipedia. It's still much more trustworthy than the AI overview that makes far too many mistakes. If I ask how big was the National Republican Army, the AI will answer me around 100,000 soldiers, because it takes this data from the 9th of April 1945 estimate. However, if I ask how many Italians fought for the Italian Social Republic, the AI will answer that around 558,000 Italians fought for the Italian Social Republic in the National Republican Army. Two very similar questions, but two very different answers. If I search info on the Battalion 9 Settembre, which served in Eastern Prussia as we already mentioned, I get a negative answer. No, the Battalion 9 Settembre never fought in Prussia, which is not correct. Even if I try to change the question by writing the Battalion 9 Settembre fought in Poland in 1944, the answer is no, the Battalion 9 Settembre never fought in Poland in 1944, giving as a source the Wikipedia page on the Battalion 9 Settembre. But the same Wikipedia page, along every other page that speaks about the Battalion 9 Settembre, states that at the end of November 1944, it was deployed in Eastern Prussia, alongside the German Division Brandenburg, fighting against the Red Army until January 1945. This is not a debated fact, this is not controversial, so why does the AI answer like that? But this is the most blatant example. Units of the Italian Social Republic in Operation Overlord. The answer is there were no units of the Italian Social Republic in Operation Overlord. But if instead of Operation Overlord I write Sbarco in Normandia, Normandy Landings, which is the unofficial name of Operation Overlord, I get a positive answer. But if I repeat the search in English, I get again a negative answer. No Italian Social Republic unit fought in Normandy, which is incorrect. Asking a more precise question, where was the Divisione Atlantica Fucilieri di Marina deployed? The AI has no choice but to tell me Normandy. Because in this way I am forcing the AI to search only pages that talk about the Divisione Atlantica Fucilieri di Marina. The biggest problem is, if I hadn't known the name of that Italian Social Republic division, I could have very well assumed that no Italian Social Republic forces ever fought in Normandy, especially if my research was in English. Look at this Reddit post. This user saw the Wikipedia page of Operation Overlord, which mentions the Italian Social Republic as part of the Axis forces, and asks if there is any truth in this, because he cannot find any other source outside of that Wikipedia page. Probably because he only searched in English. This last example of Normandy, though, doesn't depend much on Italian revisionists, who care more about the Italian campaign. This goes in the foreign group of revisionists, who love to make up that Italy somehow switched sides in World War II. Of course, some are just easily impressionable meme lovers, but others will swear that that's the truth, giving for true and granted that Italy switched sides. One of the reasons the AI overview finds almost nothing on Italian Social Republic forces in Operation Overlord is because the lack of international medias on the Italian Social Republic, a state that was victim of damnatio memoriae. And who among these foreigners are the main perpetrators? Other than memers, for sure it's British and Americans. Obviously I don't generalize. I'm well aware that in Anglo-Saxon countries, there are history enthusiasts that report history as it is without falsifying it. It would be absurd thinking otherwise. But according to my experience, Germans know much more than Anglo-Saxons what the Italienische Social Republic was. Not even Adolf Hitler considered Italians traitors. From the transcript of what he said to German generals before the Italian armistice was announced, he called King Vittorio Emanuele III a traitor. Mussolini was his friend, and he sent Otto Skorzeny to free him, to establish a new Italian state and rally the fascist troops. Traitor was a word the fascists of the Italian Social Republic used to refer to the Italian Co-belligerent forces and partisans. At times even the ones that simply peacefully surrendered. Mostly it's English and Americans who like to imply that Italians are cowards and traitors, and that the Italian Social Republic barely existed. The funny part is how the British infantry retreated and ran from Western Egypt and Somalia when the Italian infantry invaded, being able to repel Italians only when using armored divisions against infantry in the non-fortifiable North African desert. The same allies that tried everything to make King Vittorio Emanuele III immediately declare war on Germany and were frustrated by his refusal. On one side, they have an excuse. After the Kingdom of Italy surrendered and eventually collaborated with the Allies, the enemy troops in Italy were simply labeled as Germans. The official monarchy had surrendered, and the so-called official Italians were the king's men. At times, Allied soldiers might even have engaged Italian forces, not even realizing they were Italian, thinking they were Germans. But that does not excuse today's perpetuation of revisionism. The most blatant example comes from a big website, Warfare History Network. Some articles on this website are blatantly biased, seemingly trying to deny the existence of the Italian Social Republic and its armed force by not mentioning them in articles that should directly talk about them. In the Shadow of Sunrise, The Secret Surrender of Italy by Dennis Whitehead, it should talk about the surrender of Caserta of April 1945 and the collapse of the Italian Social Republic. Not once in this article the words Italian Social Republic, Republic of Salò, or Rodolfo Graziani are mentioned. It only talks about German forces signing the surrender of Caserta, failing to even mention a single time and probably purposely ignoring the existence of the Italian Social Republic and the fact that the surrender documents included the signature of Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, effectively signing the fall of the RSI and fascism in Italy. It only mentions partisans conducting anti-German operations. An article about the secret surrender of Italy in which the Italy that surrendered is not mentioned. But the most blatant case of revisionism is this article, The Gothic Line, How the Allies Breached the German Defenses in Italy, by Michael Heskew. I will insert here a clip from my previous video, debunking myths, misconceptions and revisionism on World War II Italy. A quite long article on the Gothic Line and the various battles of the Italian campaign. Incredibly, in 31 pages, there is not a single mention of the Italian Social Republic, nor of its military, always referring to the Axis troops as Germans. And what is subtle revisionism soon becomes straight-up lying in the Operation Winter Thunderstorm chapter. The Operation Winter Thunderstorm, also known as Battle of Garfagnana, was a small but successful Axis counter-offensive in central North Italy against mostly American troops in December 1944. It is known for being one of the very few battles in which Italian Social Republic soldiers outnumbered the German soldiers. 3/4 of the Axis troops were Italian, and for being the final Axis counter-offensive of the Italian front. From that moment on, the Axis was able to achieve only defensive victories in Italy. It's actually hilarious to see how the author continues to call the Axis soldiers that took part in that operation Germans, and even mentions exclusively the German units out of the Axis battle order. Elements of the German 285th and 286th Infantry Regiments, the 4th Alpine Battalion and the Mittenwald Battalion advanced up to 5 miles, capturing several villages and putting many soldiers of the 92nd Division to flight. Now let's take a look at the Axis order of battle for that operation. The 285th Infantry Regiment, the 4th Alpine Battalion and Mittenwald Battalion. Coincidentally, all Italian forces who made up the majority of the Axis troops in this operation are not mentioned. 2 Alpini battalions and a unit of the Monte Rosa Division and a battalion of the San Marco Division. To make matters even more ridiculous, the author writes on how the American 92nd Division, which was the defensive side of this counterattack, was inexperienced. He completely fails to mention how, in reality, the Axis was in a disadvantaged position, counting half the men of the Allies' divisions, less artillery and no tanks. But on Warfare History Network's credits, I found a recent article from 2023, written by James Builder. The Battle of Garfagnana, Italy's Battle of the Bulge. Here, at least the existence of the Italian Social Republic and its role in the Axis counter-offensive in Garfagnana is recognized. It claims that Italy switched sides on September 8th, which is wrong, as I already proven. Italy became a neutral country by then. It claims that a great number of Italian soldiers were revolting against Germans, which is false, as vast majority of them peacefully surrendered. It misspells Marshal Rodolfo Graziani's name. But I don't want to be too picky. The article is well written, and apart from the big mistake of claiming that Italy switched sides, I can't call it revisionist, so props to the journalist. One can only hope that more modern articles will be less revisionist. I could keep talking about all the condescending lies and revisionism from Anglo-Saxon medias on World War II Italy in general, such as the wild and hilariously wrong assumption that Michael Peck makes on this article in the National Interest, the sad story of a conscript Italian army that froze to death while fighting Russia. Here I will show another clip of mine. The National Interest is an American conservative magazine, so it shouldn't be surprising to find revisionist articles on it, in my opinion. I find a couple of sentences in this article so bad they're amusing. The soldiers of the German master race didn't think much of the emotional Italians, a feeling reciprocated by Italian soldiers, some of whom would rather have been fighting the Germans than being their allies. What does suggest that Italians would rather have been fighting the Germans other than Anglo-American revisionism? Nobody in Italy before the Armistice had any intention or will to fight against Axis or alongside the Allies, only to remain neutral, a sentiment probably shared by the considerable majority of the Italian population and the considerable majority of every civilian population of every country of every war in history. There is not a single report of such ideas in any Italian article. At the end of the article he writes, "The 8th Army returned home to Italy in March 1943, 6 months before Italy surrendered to the Allies. By September, Italy would be at war with Germany." Wrong. In September 1943, Italy surrendered and then rejoined the war on the Axis side as the Italian Social Republic. Only in October, more than 1 month after the Armistice, the Kingdom of the South, meaning the portion of the Kingdom of Italy controlled by the Allies, would declare war on Germany and by proxy the Italian Social Republic. But not mentioning the Italian Social Republic and making it sound like the Italians couldn't wait to take orders from the Allies to fight against Germany is typical of this type of revisionism. As we already said, to call it switching sides is an enormous reach, because of the existence and the size of the Italian Social Republic forces. One could claim that the Kingdom of Italy switched sides, as it would be factually correct, because the sentence doesn't include the Italian Social Republic, although it's worth noting that the Kingdom of Italy gave German forces more than 1 month to retreat from the country, and rejoined the war only after the establishment of the Italian Social Republic that aimed at wiping the Kingdom of Italy from existence. But claiming that the Kingdom of Italy switched sides is quite a misleading and easily misinterpretable sentence, as it omits that the country had been divided in two by then and would give false information to someone who ignores this historical fact. So why is fascist Italy a victim of Anglo-Saxon revisionism, and why is the Italian Social Republic omitted from most of Anglo-Saxon historical medias? First reason, boosting the otherwise limited World War II accomplishment, and here I'm referring to British revisionism, by portraying British forces as brave underdog heroes and Italian forces as coward idiots. Funny how one of the most embarrassing British defeats, Operation Daffodil, does not even have a Wikipedia page in English. Better not spread information on British defeats. This of course goes well beyond battles against Italian forces. There is plenty of British revisionism trying to save the honor of their troops from their inability to do anything in the German invasion of France, to the huge amount of times the British were defeated in North Africa by the outnumbered Axis troops of the small Africa Corps of Erwin Rommel and Italian infantry. Reason number 2, putting down the national pride of other countries. although the modern Italian Republic never suggests that Italians should be proud of fascist Italy, quite the contrary. Anglo-Saxon nationalists happily try to ridicule other countries, for example France, with the made-up fantasy sentence "France always surrenders," when they would probably struggle to name 2 instances in which France surrendered. For Italy, other than making up numbers and improbable victories against Italian forces, there's omitting the Italian Social Republic from every World War II topic. In this way, it's easy to ridicule Italy for switching sides, portraying Italians as weak, untrustworthy traitors, compared to the loyal, honorable, strong Anglo-Saxons. The Italian Social Republic's existence would disprove this statement, and the difference in numbers between the pro-Axis and the pro-Allies Italian forces after the Armistice would ridicule this statement. Just as Winston Churchill said, "Bizarre people Italians. One day 45 million fascists, the next day 45 million between anti-fascists and partisans. Yet these 90 million Italians are not from the census." Unfortunately for Churchill, it's easy to see how this statement doesn't make any sense at any point of World War II. It only makes sense if, as a good Anglo-Saxon revisionist, one pretends that the Italian Social Republic never existed and that everyone in Italy started collaborating with the Allies. Both fantasies. Reason number 3. Keeping Italy down. Again, as Winston Churchill said, talking with Vatican officials soon after the war, Italy will be able to be at peace, but it shall never rise again. It will have to stay down. A sentence that, other than showing the notorious ill feelings that Churchill had towards Italians, translates very well in our days, when Italy is a little more than a NATO military base, with the vast majority of the population aware and not hiding the fact that they are living in an American vassal state, prompting lack of trust towards every single political party that tries its best to pretend that Italy is an independent, sovereign country. Reason number 4. The generic racism and xenophobia that made Anglo-Saxon famous in the world. Of course, it goes without saying that I'm not referring to every Anglo-Saxon, every British and every American. Most of it is a watered-down nationalist version of "my country is better than yours." Unfortunately, this contributes to spread misinformation and falsify history as well. I've talked about Italian revisionism and English revisionism. Now, Italian historiography does not largely influence public opinion outside of Italy, because Italian is not a widely spoken language. English historiography instead is at times the only source of information for people from smaller countries or from outside of Europe that want to know more about World War II, since English is the international language. And this is the key problem. English revisionism has a huge reach and can easily trick people who don't know history and don't research topics in details. Italy switching sides is just one of the many sides of English revisionism. I have proven in this video the reasons and the lies that brought to this. Nobody can deny that a united Italy was never at war with Germany in World War II, nor that the Italian Social Republic forces were far larger than the co-belligerent ones, nor that those Italian Social Republic forces fought in far more fronts, nor that the number of Italian soldiers who effectively fought on both sides of the war was small. It's notorious how history is written by the victors, to quote Winston Churchill again, and while that doesn't automatically imply revisionism, the way it's written will always influence the masses. Had the Axis, and by proxy the Italian Social Republic, won the war, today Italy would be remembered as a loyal and brave country that refused to surrender and refused to obey its treacherous king, even reforming itself into a new state to continue the war alongside its allies. The Italians who collaborated with Anglo-Americans would be completely forgotten, as the protagonists of the later stages of the war would have been the fascists of the RSI. Does this sound biased to you? It does sound biased and incorrect to me, but as I showed you in this video, the numbers say that it's still more close to the truth than the revisionism that we have debunked. I will not get into details on the absurdity of calling the Italian Social Republic rather than the Kingdom of Italy a collaborationist state. But if we claim that Italy switched sides in World War II because there was a government who collaborated with the Allies, then shouldn't we claim that Greece switched to the Axis side because of the collaborationist Hellenic state? Shouldn't we claim that about Norway as well because of the Quisling government? Of course not. Revisionists claim that only regarding Italy. I invite you to do your own research if you want, translating the Italian articles and pages that talk about this. Nothing of what I presented is a conspiracy theory not accepted by conventional history. It's history of a country that is not widely known abroad because of its short life, its geographical and historical context, and because of revisionism. History never lies. Thank you for watching. I don't ask you for likes and subscriptions. I ask you to share this information, to spread the truth and call out revisionism. Do it in any way you can. Write articles, make videos, make memes in any language you can. What is important is that you spread this message so that history won't be changed and my work won't be for nothing. Thank you.